everybody. I'm Jake Newton. I'm the Vice President of Security Solutions with the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. I'm joined by our CEO, Randy Spivey, and today we want to share with you a little bit about our tiered approach for building a comprehensive workplace violence prevention and intervention program, and how that relates to our Safe Workplace certification in particular. We're going to walk through basically the process, what that looks like, hopefully give you some good takeaways, even if you're working on this process right now. But then we'll also talk about the certification program, which for some folks is kind of a newer thing to hear about. And we want to share that with you. It's been getting some considerable traction lately. So typical webinar style for everybody here. I'm sure everybody's been through about 100 of these now since the beginning of the pandemic. But if you do have questions, you can send them through the question and answer tab. We also have the chat live too. So if you happen to send it over there, I'll try my best to get all of those answered throughout the webinar. Before we get started, basically for those of you that don't know, I'm the Vice President of Security Solutions for the company. So basically what that means for us is I run our operations and oversee our business development side of things. I'm kind of situated in between. By background, I started off my career in the Air Force in the career field known as SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, which is dedicated to training people how to survive an extreme crisis like a hostage situation or a detention by foreign government, prisoner of war kind of circumstance, or even, wilderness or urban survival kind of things as well. Joined CPPS back in 2014 and have primarily been here since. But with that, I'll pass it over to Randy to get us rolling into the meat of the presentation here. Randy.
Well, thank you, Jake. And good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on what part of the country you're in. It's a pleasure to spend a few minutes talking about how do we set up effective violence prevention and response programs. We're gonna angle the program and presentation towards the workplace, but really when we talk about setting up a violence prevention response program, these are skills and information that applies anywhere in society. So when we talk about, how do you respond to extreme violence, or how do you train people to be able to respond to an active shooter or active assailant, obviously that's not just in the workplace, that's, could be at church on Sunday. And so we're going to talk about how the principles of these training is transferable even to family members and our kids at an age appropriate level. But yeah, I'm the CEO and founder of CPPS. I started the company in November of 2002. I was in the Air Force also and was an intel officer. And I used to run and provide oversight to all of the high-risk survival programs in the U.S. military. And so, and then we would also provide direct training to those that the military in the United States deemed to be at the highest risk of being either kidnapped or detained by a government. And we train them how basically to get through extreme situations that they might find while they're doing their missions. And so after 9/11, though, I formed the company because I realized there were people and organizations at risk of these type of high-risk situations beyond the special forces units that we were training in the military. And so in November of 2002, we started the company with a focus pretty narrow at the time on kidnap survival and training people to travel to high-risk locations. But then in 2007, there was the Virginia Tech shooting and that tragedy. And I remember when that incident occurred, watching the after-action reports and some of the fallout of that incident. And after that tragedy, what happened was you had people talking about gun control. They were talking about law enforcement response strategies. They were talking about mass notification. How do we get the word out quicker? Because that was a big takeaway from that particular shooting. But at the time, nobody was talking about what do you do if you're one of the faculty members or those students when he came in with a gun. And because we had done this training for the military, we knew that there was a real significant difference in how people in a crisis respond, if they've been trained or not. And basically, the people that are trained and untrained, the initial shock of something like a kidnapping or an active shooter, the initial response is going to be startled, fearful, and then they either move into freezing and holding on to other people for support, or they just react. Where trained individuals are going to be startled and shocked, but then they're going to have some kind of a frame of reference in how to respond effectively. And we knew from the research in the military that about 10% of people without training in a crisis are going to be able to respond effectively. About 10% of people that have had training in the crisis are going to make mistakes, they're going to mess it up. But it's that 80% in the middle that the training really impacted. And so what we saw happen at Virginia Tech, the shooter, he shot a couple of kids in one of the classrooms. Then he walked down the hallway, he left the classroom for about 2 minutes. And then after 2 minutes, he comes back in, and guess where those kids were? They were sitting on the floor holding on to each other. And then he just walked around and killed 6 more. So when I saw that, I said to myself, if we can train Delta Force on how to respond in a crisis, I suspect we can put some kind of training out there and guidance on how to deal with an extreme situation like an active shooter. And at the time, this is 2007, there was no run, hide, fight, there was no government policy. And so we put out a video called Shots Fired, which was the very first training and guidance in the US on what to do in an extreme situation like the Virginia Tech shooting. So that's what led us over the years now. So fast forward 2007 to 2022, the last 15 years, we spend working with organizations on how to not just train people for active shooter, but how do we prevent the violence from happening? And how do we do that in our schools? How do we do it in our workplaces? How do we do it in the government agencies? And how do you do it in a healthcare environment where you're trying to, you're not just trying to survive, but you're also trying to protect and be caregivers. So, and the nuances with that. So that's what's led us to work with thousands of organizations over the years. Over half the Fortune 100 corporations we've worked with directly in these kind of areas, and we'll go more specifically into what's that based on, and how do you set up a holistic program. But we were not just early adopters; we were the early developers of the guidance in the U.S. on dealing with active shooters. So, okay, next slide. So, what are we grounding the content to? There have been several iterations of what is now the ASIS national standard on workplace violence and active assailant prevention, intervention, response. It's gone through national standards, it's gone through guidelines, but it's the newest version of this is a nice comprehensive document that shows how to go through a multi-tiered approach on setting up a violence prevention and response program. So we use that as part of the baseline for the programs that we're going to talk about. The other component is OSHA has put out directives and instructions in the area of workplace violence, in particular, what needs to be inside a program. Also that workplace violence is a foreseeable risk and is part of a duty of care responsibilities for having a safe workplace. They require it. And if an incident occurs in a workplace in the United States, they will have the ability to, if they choose to go and investigate it and use this document to say, okay, did you have a program in place? Did you have training in place? Was there reporting procedures? Was there programmatics around it? And we'll talk more about liability in a little bit, but OSHA, the main hit that comes to organizations from getting written up and fined isn't the monetary value necessarily. I mean, nobody wants a $50,000 fine, but when you talk about the civil liability, what happens is that if OSHA comes in and says you didn't have a program in place, and they write it up, and now you have a formal document from a government agency, and now say the family members or the participants that were hurt or killed, the families of the individuals, and then they come in and file civil litigation, and we're seeing a shift in major payouts over the last 6 months. Some actually coming from the government. In the case of the shooting down at a church in Texas, the Air Force was held liable, and a major payout came out of that. And we've seen it in just civil litigation. So those are two of the three areas that we base these programs on. The other component has to do with, because we worked with so many different organizations over the years, both federal government agencies, large corporations, were able to benchmark and compare and contrast and pull out best practices that organizations are using and using effectively. So when you look at the approach that we're talking about, it's a bit of a hybrid, if you will, between the ASIS national standard, OSHA directives, and just the best practice that we've seen used in hundreds of organizations around the country.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that too, Randy, is when we start applying this to other industries, namely, I know we have some healthcare folks on the call with us. You just had your Joint Commission standards for workplace violence released in January, or that became effective, for example. And we take all of those different things into consideration. So when we're working with an organization, we're looking through the lens of what's the prevailing standards. So if you look at the Joint Commission standards that we just have now, they're more robust than certainly what they were, but still in comparison to like the ASIS American National Standard, it's quite a bit more vague. So we mesh and synthesize all of these things together, look through that lens of standardization, look through the lens of best practice, and then we also look through the lens of your organizational culture. Because at the end of the day, if you try to build a program like this that doesn't walk, talk, and sound like your organization, it's not going to work as best as it can. So we really apply those three lenses building out this program. So what we can do is start walking through what that actually looks like. And for an organization, this is primarily going to apply for your corporation. This will apply to healthcare. There's some different nuances per industry, and we'll try to address those the best we can. But this tiered approach we found to be very effective for looking at the whole picture of what these documents say that a program needs. Ultimately, we start off with the assessment. Sometimes the assessment can be a validation piece, looking backwards as well. We've implemented a program and now we want to look back and see if there's any remaining gaps. But we start off with an assessment. Where's our gaps in our programs? What vulnerabilities do we have? And then how can we implement the rest of the program to address those different issues that appear from an assessment? The second piece is what we call program development, but it's basically creating the policies, the plans and procedures that drive the program. And what we've really found is that it ultimately comes down to three core documents. The first one is a workplace violence prevention intervention policy. So just as one example, a lot of times we see a no tolerance stance for workplace violence, where the guidance out there says you really want to take a no threats, no violence stance, because when you're building a policy, zero tolerance can have kind of a punitive feel to it. So we say no threats, no violence, because we know there's a progression oftentimes that people will take before they just automatically terminate somebody, for example. So the policy is one document. The next one is what we call a threat management team governance. But what this effectively accomplishes is formalizing a multidisciplinary approach or a threat management team. Who's on that team? What are their responsibilities? What's the implementation plan for the program? And then it really codifies the incident management framework for an organization as well. So when you actually start receiving reports, how are those things going to be handled? We call it a governance document. The third thing that the standards are saying that you really need to have in place now is basically an active assailant protocol. At least that's what we call it. And that is the readiness, response, and recovery considerations for something like an active assailant. So what kind of training do you need to provide to employees? What is going to be your communications protocols? How are you going to manage an incident that is a crisis such as that? How is the organization going to respond? Mass notification, things like that. How is individuals going to respond? And then, of course, that recovery piece, you've got the psychological effects, you've got the long-term care, you've got the scene management immediately after the incident. So there's a full process that needs to be planned for, and you can have a protocol that guides what that looks like. So you've got the assessment, you've got the program development. Once you establish that, then you start laying in those different tiers of training.
Thank you, Jake. And then when we go to tier 2, what you have is a multifaceted approach to training all the employees. And when we first put out the program called Shots Fired in 2007, which was, as I mentioned earlier, it was the first guidance or training on what to do in an active shooter situation. What we found in 2007 was that we'd have security directors and departments have this new training program on active shooter, and they go to the HR department or legal department and say, hey, we need to do active shooter training in our company. And they'd get a lot of pushback. And they said, we're not going to do that. First of all, we want to tell people to do something and open up liability to us as an organization if we say the wrong thing. Number two, we don't want to scare people. We don't make them think that, okay, we know things that you don't know, and so we're covering our own backside by doing some training. And it was just kind of an isolated piece. And so there were some early adopters to that, but it got a lot of pushback to start with. But then what we started to see was over a couple of years, first of all, the incidence of extreme violence continued and still continued to increase in frequency. But when the program for how do you establish a holistic awareness training program for all the employees, and it's approached from a perspective of, we're not just talking about active shooter, we're talking about how do we keep our workplace safe. And we're talking about how do we help people that might be in a distressed state. We were talking about, there are things that we can do to actually prevent these things from occurring. And then, the last component is, okay, what do we do if the worst case scenario happens and somebody comes in with a gun? But we want the majority of the focus to be around how do we prevent this and how do we just keep our holistic work environment safe as we can. And so tier 2 is awareness training for all employees, not just for HR and security, but for everybody. And what it does is it puts everybody in the same foundation of a baseline of understanding of these 5 areas. What is workplace violence? How do we define it? A lot of people think, well, workplace violence is an active shooter. Well, yeah, it is, but there's the number of workplace shootings that take place compared to the number of workplace violent incidents that take place. It's a very small percentage. However, over 2 million incidents are reported a year, according to the Department of Labor, and it's costing just U.S. corporations alone about over 120 billion a year. So this is a big number. So that's when we talk about what is workplace violence? How do we define it? It's more than just 2 people getting in a fight or somebody who was a high-risk employee. We terminated them and they came back and started shooting. It's much broader than that. So that's part 1. Part 2 is because it's a myth that people just snap. Almost always there are red flags, and sometimes they're posted on social media. But there are red flags, and what are they? What are the behavioral cues that somebody might be progressing towards violence? And so one of the key components of the awareness training is educating people on what are the red flags that they might observe with somebody, a colleague or a coworker, and then it's a red flag that they need help. And so we go through that in the awareness training. What's interesting is when we've been working in a virtual environment like we're doing right now, what are those red flags? What does it look like if I see something, in the background of Jake's presentation and it's causing me concern, or he says something or reacts in a certain way? How do I respond to that? And so, the programs that are put together now, they need to be able to talk about, okay, what are the warning signs in a hybrid environment? What are the warning signs in a face-to-face environment, in a traditional workspace? And then what do we do about it when we see them? So that's the third step. Who do I report it to? Are there anonymous ways? Because part of the reasons that people don't report things is they don't want to get involved, or they don't want people to know that they're involved. So how do we put in effective reporting procedures and capabilities where people can feel safe and come forward with concerns that they might have? So that's number 3. The 4th issue on awareness training is the issue of domestic or intimate partner violence. And this is an important one, even though it's difficult. It's difficult because it's so personal, but it's critical because of 2 reasons. One is the volatility and potential lethality that comes out of domestic violence relationships. About 1/4 to 1/3 of the workplace shootings that happen are coming out of a domestic violence relationship. And the second area is how prevalent it is. You probably have seen the statistics. 1 out of 3 women have been, are in, or will be in a domestic violence relationship. 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7 men, and it can be in same-sex relationships. But it's critical that we're able to cover not just what is domestic violence, but what are the indicators that somebody that is your coworker might be involved in that, and how it could impact the workplace, so that the work team can try and come around that person and give them support. We can't do it unless you know about it. And then the last one, the very, the fifth area of awareness training is, what do you do in extreme violence? Somebody comes in with a knife, they come in with a gun, they threaten a bomb. How do we train people? We have a saying that, before first responders arrive in an extreme violence event, the employees are in what's called the extreme danger gap. And they're the immediate responders before the first responders arrive. And what is they do or don't do in that extreme danger gap makes a big difference on how they get through it. And so that's where the training comes in, to enable and empower them to do it. And in fact, I talked a little bit about the difference between trained and untrained earlier. If you look at the number of people that were killed in Virginia Tech in that untrained response. Another example would be, if you remember the nightclub shooting down in Orlando, Florida, several years ago, where you had one guy in a confined area that shot and killed 49 people, shot over 100 of them. And anytime you see one of these extreme violence scenarios with one gunman and 10, 12, 20, 30 fatalities, that you're going to see that freeze response and people not knowing how to respond effectively. And that's the power of doing the training. So I talked about how the pushback came when they just focus on doing an active shooter training. But when it's part of a whole package, how do we recognize the warning signs? What's our role within that? What are the myths about violence prevention? And then if it does happen, whether it's here or anywhere out, I'm walking around downtown or in a restaurant, I have some tools to be able to respond effectively. And that's where you get into the run, hide, fight protocol, or we talk about figure out, get out, hide out, take out, that type of responses that are embedded in this awareness training. So those are the 5 tiers. And, some companies, they will make it available as optional training. Some organizations actually make it part of the onboarding process for new employees. Some companies make it mandatory. We encourage that because we see that as, this is happening enough now. And based on the documents that are out there, that this really should be something that all employees get. So that's tier 2 awareness training. So tier 3 is going
one thing I just wanted to emphasize really quick, Randy, based on some of the things you're sharing is, with a lot of the organizations we've partnered with that have shared how they've done training historically, and just, providing training that talks about that last bullet there, how to respond to an active shooter situation or active assailant training. What providing this full spectrum really does is add a lot of confidence and make it more like the confidence that you get from just simply putting on your seatbelt, because they get that fuller context that violence is preventable. There is a process that people go through. People don't just snap, and they get that fuller context before we're just going to talk about the extreme situations like responding to, an extreme crisis or extreme violence. And so if you're doing a program, consider that as part of building in the different components on the front side, because it'll really help add that confidence level to folks that you're training on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jake. And one of the other things that I see on the awareness training level is, particularly with large companies that have operations inside the United States and outside the US, there is a mindset and a perspective outside the US that this gun violence is primarily a US issue. And so they say, well, how do we train our people in the UK or over in France or elsewhere on awareness training? What do we include in that? Is it the same, or how do we modify it? And so what happens is we focus more on the international community of, responding to extreme violence, whether it's, a truck driving down the boardwalk in Nice, France, or it's a gun threat at a cafe in Paris. Being able to respond effectively in the crisis is the same. You have to figure it out. You got to respond, and you try and minimize the threat, but you don't just freeze. However, the threat might be different. It could be more of a terrorism type of threat. And so that awareness training for international community is going to focus more on situational awareness. Am I being followed by somebody if I'm walking around town? What is potential threats from a terrorist type of event? in a public environment. So you're still going to have that awareness training and trying to prevent and respond, but it's going to be a little bit different than just focused in on an active shooter in a work environment that we might see more in the United States than do in certain other countries. So then tier 3 is what we call enhanced guidance for leaders, managers, and supervisors. And what's interesting is that when we work with large organizations, whether federal agencies or a Fortune 100 corporation, often this is the weakest link in these 5 tiers. They may have a policy, they may, well, most of them will have some kind of a policy. They may have some level of harassment training or something where they talk about workplace violence, but oftentimes they don't have a program dedicated for the manager and leader level that trains them on how to recognize how serious a threat might be. If one of the tier 2 recognition, an employee sees something, they report it to the manager. They don't have training on how to either recognize this is a big enough of a concern that I need to push it up to the tier 4, the threat management team, or they have something that they have an individual that's in a distressed, upset state, and so somebody reports it, and then they go in and try to do an intervention with the individual, and they have no training on de-escalation, and they just make it worse. So they might have something on a scale of 1 to 10 that's a 5, and now they go in there and just blow it up into an 8. And I heard a story about that just yesterday about how some untrained individuals, they actually almost created an active shooter incident that based on really poorly handling somebody that was having a difficult time. So fortunately it didn't, but it got pretty close. And in large part, it had to do with that manager level not knowing how to really be a listener, try and de-escalate, and get the person help when there was an opportunity to do that. So that's where the tier 3 focuses on. It's going to talk about threat awareness, not to the level of tier 4, where you're going to be evaluating threats, but enough to say, okay, this is a DLR, this doesn't look right, and so we need to get some help here. Or 2, I'm going to exercise empathic listening, my good communication skills, and the ability to de-escalate and get people help. And I've done some of these webinars, and people are asked the question, is this needed now in a virtual environment, or is it needed now post-pandemic? I mean, if there's only one skill set to train managers on right now, I would recommend it be de-escalation, because there are Surgeon General came out a couple of weeks ago saying that the number one issue we're dealing with right now is mental health. It's not the pandemic. It hadn't been for a bit of time. And the outcome of the pandemic has put people under extraordinary levels of stress. And the escape behaviors, the drug addictions, the alcohol, the addictions, and then just people acting out. I mean, look at the airplanes. We're seeing more and more people act crazy on airplanes than any time I've been flying around for 25 years. So that de-escalation is a key skill, and it's one that we focus a lot in on the manager level. Jake, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say that my colleague Dave Benson shares quite often is, this program is an informational process. So if garbage goes into the system, you're going to get garbage back. And so when we're specifically talking about, manager and supervisor training, let's say a report goes straight from an employee, somebody submits an anonymous report on a hotline or whatever it may be, and that gets to the threat management team. Well, one of those folks they will probably end up chatting with is a manager of that individual of concern. And so if the manager is trained, then they can better support that threat management team in their investigation process and help provide them the information that they need to know to better make a formal threat assessment of the likelihood for potential violence or, what potential intervention strategies might be. So that's why this process is so critical to have every component laid in, because it's that's what makes it truly comprehensive and makes every part and every layer of the program flow smoothly. And so that's why manager and supervisor training is so critical. When we go up the pyramid here, you actually get into the threat management team training, the development of a multidisciplinary team. responsible for oftentimes actually managing this program, but also responsible for assessing threats, managing those threats, and handling the situations that arise that tend to be, for lack of a better term, particularly sticky. And so the standards say for this team, we want to have folks on there like HR, security, legal, of course, maybe facilities would staff this team. Maybe you have somebody from corporate communications, depending on your organization. Sometimes union individuals will be on this team. But you want to have that core team that is responsible for looking into these different issues. When they receive reports, they can do something about it. And this team, the standards say we want to train them initially. We want to give them core training on how to make a threat assessment, how to manage those threats over time, what intervention strategies are available and need to be implemented, investigating, and what goes into that. The safe terminations, the concept of soft landings. Those are all the things that we really want to provide to this team. And then beyond that, we want to continue on periodically building upon that foundation, because this team really requires the standard, the ASIS standards calls it specifically the psychological, the behavioral and the psychological background and nuances for violence. And so we want to really give them that information that they can use to really manage these different issues. So you got the training as one part. The other part is that real-time behavioral threat assessment and management expertise externally. So it talks about if you have those cases, or if you need that assistance from an actual expert in this industry, then you can reach out and get that added help. Maybe you need a formal threat assessment. Maybe you need somebody to look at a written threat, or somebody's making a threat on social media and you want somebody to look at that writing to perform analysis or whatever it might be. But you can get that added reach when it's needed for those issues that are particularly tricky. So that's kind of the threat management side. But like I was saying earlier, this team is also generally going to be the ones that manage this program and oversee it too. So they really need that added training to be able to qualitatively go through this entire process.
Then there's what we call Tier 5, and this is the executive team. And one of the things that I'm seeing over the last couple of years is that historically, when we talk about putting in a violence prevention program, usually the champions and the program owners have been either HR or security, and sometimes they've had difficulty getting buy-in from the leadership, trying to roll out a holistic program and get the resources behind it, including the time to create this and implement it. But what I've seen start to shift over the last two, actually started right before the pandemic, is that more and more the executive team is, starting with the board of directors to the C-suite, is coming down to HR and security saying, what are we doing to protect our people? I see this happen time and time again on the news. What do we have in place for our people? I met with a CEO of one of Warren Buffett's companies a couple of years ago, and he was saying to me, he said, Randy, I see the things in the news and I see what's happening in my own city. And he says, I just couldn't live with myself if I knew that there was training that I could provide to try and minimize this from happening to my employees, but I just didn't do it. And so we're glad to have you here, and we're glad to put this program into place, and getting that top buy-in helps to just roll it out across the enterprise. So sometimes people will start with Tier 5. More often than not, they'll get the buy-in, the blessing from the executive team, roll out the holistic program, and then do a capstone at the end of this whole program implementation with the executive team, in which talks about what we just accomplished, what was covered, what are the benefits, to include liability protection and minimize liability exposure, and how it's been received by the team, the entire workforce. So that takes about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. And many times it's when we talk about the safe workplace certification here in just a moment, the whole certification culminates in a presentation to this executive team of that workplace certification and the presentation of Tier 5. So what is the safe workplace certification? I'm going to just kind of tee that up and talk a little bit about how we developed this. but then I'm gonna let Jake go through what's included in the components of it. But we established this about 4 years ago, based on organizations needing to have some type of a third-party validation that they are doing what's required. And based on what's in those documents that we talked about earlier, the national standard, OSHA directives, the Joint Commission for Healthcare or other accredited bodies. And so, and they wanted to be able to have that so that they could say, we have a program in place, we've had a third party come in and evaluate it and partner with us to create it. And not only that, but if we have an incident, they're willing to come in and testify on our behalf if there's subsequent litigation. So, the Safe Workplace Certification, what is it not? It's not an individual certification, it's an organizational certification. So it's certifying a body, a company, a nonprofit organization, a healthcare organization. It's a certification that says you've gone through and done what you can. It also doesn't mean that an incident cannot happen, but any more than putting your kids through driver's ed means they couldn't get in a car crash or a fender bender. But it does mean that hopefully we've done the things that can be done to prevent it and have the program in place. And then if something does happen, that we recover more quickly. In fact, the whole framework of a prevention and response program is readiness. That's the prevention side. Response. Okay, if we have something, here's how we're going to respond in the immediate. And then recovery. How do we recover after this takes place? So the Safe Workplace Certification helps organizations build that framework from those different tiers, tiers 1 through 5 that we've been covering. So Jake, why don't you take it from there? And one other thing that I would say before we talk about the benefits of this program is that what I'm finding is two things. Corporate leadership, organizational leadership like this concept. They like to be able to say we are Safe Workplace Certified as defined by how we're getting ready to define it. And we'll talk a few more benefits that we've heard from the insurance sector as well in just a moment.
Yeah, so if you recall those lenses that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, looking through the lens of the standards that are out there, best practices, and then your organizational culture, the certification program is really the culmination of the three. And then after going through the process, it's really a way for you to demonstrate to whoever you need to, and we'll talk about who that might be in a minute, but it's a way to demonstrate that you are in fact consistent with the standards, that you have done what you can do, and have a way to show that in a very consolidated manner. So in addition to some of the things that we just talked about is going through this process, there's other mile markers that we have as part of this program that really benchmark or standardize the level of which you do things to. And so, for example, tier 1 is pretty straightforward. We go through the assessment. We look at where the program is currently falling short of the standards, and we say, here's exactly what you need to do to get to that place of consistency. So then after that's accomplished, we go through the policy, governance, active assailant protocol development. The standards say to basically perform an exercise after you build that protocol to make sure that it's effective for your organization. Tier 2, so we say, okay, build a training program that's consistent with the standards, but then also train your employee population to a minimum level completion of 75%. And the reason is because it's kind of like the concept of herd immunity. You got people coming and going all the time. It's nearly impossible to get 100%. And so if we can get 75%, kind of like Randy was talking about, if we can hit that 80% level of people trained, they're the ones that are going to know what to do. Well, then they can be leaders and so on in an incident like this. But it's that concept of herd immunity. We want that awareness across the organization. Of course, if we get more of that, we would love to, but that 75% is the minimum completion rate for the CERT program. Same thing for the manager level. We want to get that for managers and supervisors with their enhanced training. And the content in this, because it's kind of, it varies between the documentation that's out there. But for example, the ASIS standard doesn't actually stipulate de-escalation specifically. That's more of a best practice. And so we culminate those different things into the certification program. So we say deeper information about workplace violence, For example, that is what we call, giving people an understanding of steady state behavior or baseline behavior so they can better recognize when somebody is struggling. We talk about threat awareness, which is the concept of how do you know if somebody's making a threat or posing a threat. It's one thing if somebody makes a threat, but then can they actually follow through on that, for example? So those are the things that we're providing in the manager training as part of the CERT program. For the threat management team, as you can imagine, we're doing the core training. We want to train the team as a team. One of the discrepancies that we sometimes see out there, it's not really a discrepancy, but it can be sometimes a shortcoming, but you have individuals in the organization that have been trained formally for threat assessment, which is great. That's a wonderful start. But to really have that maximum effectiveness, we want to train that team as a team. We want to validate that there's a centralized record keeping process for managing and tracking and assessing threats. And then, of course, we want to have that real-time threat assessment capability for that added reach when it's needed. The last piece on there is Tier 5, which is effectively giving the executive team that awareness, help establishing that top-down commitment in the program or that sponsorship. We give them a feel of what's in the standards so they can have a better understanding of that. And then a lot of times, like Randy was saying, we often provide them, well, what's the process we've gone through to get to this stage so that they can have an understanding of how to even support it going forward. Generally, that's a short briefing to really instill that foundation and that commitment to the program. But that's some of the added metrics that we have as the certification criteria. And then for the annual side of things, it's basically maintaining and updating the program. So for the threat management team, as I mentioned earlier, we want periodic training. Well, we do that periodic training. We build upon it on an annual basis. Other times we're just going through and validating that everything is current. Policies don't need to change every single year. But one example that did just happen is we had some new standards published over the past couple of years. And with those changes, we need to make those updates. So we go through that process and constantly keep the program on the most current status that it can be to effectively address all of these different issues within an organization. So that's a high level of the actual criteria. Of course, we can answer any questions at the end, but that's a little bit beyond what's in the actual standards. What I like to say sometimes when I'm chatting with people about this informally is that going through this process is effectively really creating a best practice program because you are addressing, like Randy said, you're addressing everything that you can. It's not saying you can't have an incident, but you are addressing everything that you can to be as prepared as possible.
So, there's some benefits that come from that. Number one, as Jake's talked about, it establishes the consistency with those standards. I mentioned that if there was to be an incident occurred and subsequent litigation, it gives you access to the experts on our team to come in and testify on what the certification is and the benefits of it and how the organization has done its due diligence to try and prevent it from happening. Another one, and I didn't really see this when I started the program, but I'm finding that it's easier to get the executive team buy-in to be able, when they're approached with a holistic program. So in other words, it's not just a video, it's not just a threat assessment retainer, it's not just a crisis management team. This is from a policy to the C-suite and all different levels of training based on the role they are in the organization. It's a comprehensive program. Leaders in the organization seem to be buying into that pretty quickly. And in fact, they kind of look at it, the reaction I'm seeing is, oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And why are we not doing that? Why wouldn't we want to do that? And we would love to be safe workplace certified. Two other areas as far as related to premium and liability insurance. I personally have talked with the senior underwriters at large business-to-business insurance companies and about the safe workplace certification. And they said, we love certifications because it takes risks and puts them kind of in a box. And they said, we wouldn't necessarily say, okay, if you're safe workplace certified, we're going to give your company a 5% premium reduction automatically. But they said, if I have the same company side by side and one is certified and one's not, The one that is certified, their premium is going to be less. They just are not going to, disclose that with a standard, percentage deduction. The other bullet about liability exposure, what I was involved in a court case several years ago in which it was a workplace shooting, and they didn't have a program in place. And when the attorneys were representing the families, or one family in particular, they were using this ASIS standard, which at the time was a guideline, and they were going through it and say, okay, did you have a policy? Did you have training? Did you have these different components? And the cost of that to the organization of not having a program in place, it was a settlement somewhere in the $5 to $6 million range. And so some of the recent settlements have been in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So having this certification, I believe, would help to, doesn't mean it eliminates the exposure, but it certainly isn't going to hurt when you say we're consistent with OSHA and the national standards. And then another benefit that we've seen happen, some organizations actually are using the certification to communicate internally to their employees that we care about your safety. We're committed to this program and doing everything we can to prevent any kind of mishaps and violence in our workspace. And we want to give you training and equip you with content you can take home to your families. And they're using this as recruiting new hires, and then keeping the ones they have. So, you're thinking about going over here. Well, we're Safe Workplace certified, and they're not. And so they're using that as a differentiator in some of their employee retention and acquisitions. So those are some of the benefits that we're seeing so far of the certification. So like I said, it's a relatively new program. In addition to the Safe Workplace certification, what we're finding in the last 12 months is more and more people are expressing interest in individual certification. So Safe Workplace certification is a certification for the whole company or the organization. But we've had a number of organizations that are saying, okay, we want to do this program, but in all 5 of those tiers, by the way, it can be done virtually. And delivered virtually and online, especially in this post-COVID pandemic world. But a lot of organizations are now saying we want to certify, we have 200,000 employees in 40 different countries, and we don't just want to roll this out online. We want to train our HR representatives or our security professionals on how to teach that tier 2 and tier 3 awareness training and manager training in particular. And so do you have a program and where we can take this content that we're partnering with you on and train our people to go out into the field and be there to answer questions, or to do it in a more enhanced way? Maybe we'll use the online for initial training and recurring, but in between that, we want to have face-to-face or virtual in-person training like we're doing now. So we do have this. We have for both the awareness training and the manager training, online certification courses for individuals. And went from going through that, and it's fairly in depth. The awareness training is about 5 hours, and the manager training, I think, is about another 3 hours. But it provides professionals with a standardized curriculum that's already been vetted. And it's got our videos, training videos on the prevention, and we actually have vignettes in there on de-escalation where you have a distressed individual and they come into a manager and one run response, the manager does a terrible job, and then we contrast that with them doing a good job. And they're good tools for using in live training sessions. And so that comes with the individual certification. And I've seen in the last 12 months a real spike in this. That's why we included that in today's presentation. So we have the organizational certifications, that's the 5 tiers. And then we have the individual certification for folks to go out into the field or work with their employees at that tier 2 awareness training and tier 3 manager training. We have both of those online.
Yeah, the perfect example of that, I was just having this conversation a few days ago. Manufacturing, you got people out on the floor working machines. They don't have access to computers, for example, and you train and equip somebody that does, give them the information, and then maybe they only get 10 minutes with people on a regular basis or something, or want to do a lunch and learn. Well, then they can just take out the piece that talks about concerning behavior, or they take out the piece that talks about de-escalation, and then they can just kind of keep that information flowing. And that's one of those ways that really helps these kinds of things become part of a culture and increase that, that employee safety and security. So just an example of, how that works with different industries. With that being said, folks, we appreciate you coming. We want to open up the floor for any questions you might have, and would love to, connect with you further after this. If you do have any follow-on questions that you'd like to talk offline about, we have been putting a lot more emphasis onto, LinkedIn and YouTube. So if you're looking for ongoing information, we provide some pretty valuable content out there. In January, for example, we focused on threat assessment and threat management. There's some really good nuggets and videos you can go pull. But what questions do y'all have? We'll keep on here for a couple minutes and answer those the best we can.
One question sometimes I'll get is people say, well, how long does this take to go through the organizational certified? And, you can do it as slow or as fast as you want to. But on average, what do you think, Jake? It's taken groups about 18 months to walk through the process and get the people trained and to come back with the, validation of the people who've been trained, things like that?
Yeah, 18 months is a good amount of time, 12 to 18 months. Sometimes it can take 3-4 months to implement awareness training, depending on the size of the organization. So it's no small lift, certainly, but we have done this process, in like 6 to 8 months. I will say that is a really quick process. But when you can really take your time and do it right, do it well, 18 months is that probably that time frame, I'd say too. Yep.
And the other thing, I had people talk about, well, if we get the certification, and Jake talked about the recertification, and it's easier to keep it maintained once you got it. But sometimes people know, I work in a really large company. How do I do it for 200,000 people? Well, we have some Fortune 50 companies right now that are going through the Safe Workplace certification. And I think one of them has around 250,000 employees. So it can be done. Obviously you're doing distributed and e-learning and things like that. And there's some tracking to go with that. But I think what you're going to see is more and more interest in this program over the next 12 to 24 months, particularly as people are going back into the workspace. I heard yesterday from a colleague at DHS that they got the heads up that everybody's heading back to work, or a lot of them are, in like 3 weeks into work as far as the offices. So,
yeah, and that's kind of one of the big generalized questions I get in this season is, well, we're not in the office, and everybody's working from home. It's not going to change for the foreseeable future. So, violence prevention program development really isn't a large issue for us. Well, the threats have changed, but they certainly have not gone away. Kind of how Randy was talking about, you can see concerning behavior the same on a computer screen on a virtual meeting the way that you can in the typical office. And largely this is becoming increasingly a societal issue. You're having these, a lot of these incidents happen in public spaces, and so when you're equipping people, this is truly a life skill that you're giving them. It's more than just a workplace issue. This truly is a societal thing that, we really need to empower our communities rather than just our workplaces.
Yeah. And I'll just close with that, the goal of this is to build resiliency. It's to build resiliency within individuals, and make them aware, situational awareness, create the resiliency, then within the organization. And then you create enough resiliency in different organizations, and this is whether it's a school, a church, house of worship, a business, or a government agency, it doesn't matter. The more and more you build this resiliency, the more you build resilient communities. And that's when you start seeing shifts in violence, starting to really go down, because we got 80% of people become stakeholders in their own neighborhoods and in their own families, and when they're out around. That's where it makes it more robust and resilient communities. So thank you so much.
Folks, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the time, everybody. We will follow up with your emails to give you the recording, of course, and you know, a little bit of follow-on information. We're always available if you have follow-on questions. But have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk more soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.